Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of the War Report. I'm not sure whether I'll title this as a special episode or an extra, but I'll figure that out on the post-production details. But we just had a few blind spots we missed on last show on Monday, and I wanted to address those, and also some breaking news today, particularly about Afghanistan. But I wanted to get into some Russia-Ukraine news, and you were actually filling me in on this, so I'll let you take the reins for this part of the episode before we get into the Afghanistan stuff.
A lot has been happening. I think I mean, the show was over an hour, but we didn't really have enough time to, I think, spend more time on what's happening in Ukraine, but also to work out some strategies about why it's happening. Um, we touched on some of them. I did mention Nord Stream 2. I also got mixed up as I was talking about Nord Stream 2. I had some notes of the other pipelines, and I mistakenly said that Nord Stream 1 was going through land. Doesn't go through land. Nord Stream 1, like Nord Stream 2, is underwater. Anyways, I just that was one of the things I wanted to clarify. But I think it's important to understand like the deeper strategy of Ukraine, Donbass, Crimea. We've touched on it before, but I think we could get into let's say more depth. So one of the things that I'll use as a platform to launch is that I said, if there should be an attack, it will be to lure the Russians to fight back. At which case, that would cause panic within Europe. Certainly, the media would portray it that way, and that would bind Merkel in a moral dilemma where she would have to abandon Nord Stream 2. Now, that was a possibility. It still remains a possibility, but I think since our recording on Sunday, I think it's looking less and less like a possibility. So Russia, I think, played this right. They amassed so many troops, and their ability to strike Ukrainian targets in Ukraine without ever crossing into Ukrainian territory is such that Ukraine, I think, has basically declined. Now, I say that, but there has been a ceasefire agreement that Ukraine has broken. They have started shelling Donbass again, but it is not serious. And I mean, it is serious, of course. It's civilian, but it's not the mass attack that I think many of us were thinking might happen prior to the Russian concentration of forces on Ukrainian borders. And so, but why is this? Like, besides the Nord Stream 2, why is this happening? Well, very much, Ukraine is very much a frozen conflict right now, and in many ways, Russia would prefer that it remain a frozen conflict. That is, should Ukraine decide we will have an accord with Russia, we will allow the annexation of Donbass and Crimea in order to speed up the process of becoming a NATO member. Now, for Russia, that too is a red line. It was understood even after the fall of the Soviet Union that that would not happen. And in fact, one of the preemptive measures that Russia, of course, did was it requested the nuclear missiles that it gave Ukraine back, and Ukraine followed through. But ostensibly, it would be like that never happened if Ukraine joins NATO. So that's a no-no. Now, the Minsk agreement, of course, asks for a federalization of Ukraine, particularly in the east. Now, of course, Ukraine is dead set against that, and even, I would say, even more so, America is dead set against that. America understands that it needs a dense, highly concentrated force pointed at Russia. and federalization would weaken this.
I
So,
know
of
the
course,
numbers are
Ukraine,
nowhere near comparable, but I think another thing to consider about federalization is a pretty significant Hungarian population in the West. You'll remember, as we talked about, at least I talked about, I made a video about this a while back during the summer, about the expiration of the Trianon Treaty, where
yeah,
there's all these Hungarian diaspora in all these neighboring countries. Ukraine's one of the less ones. Now, Slovakia, there's a ton. Romania, there's a ton. Croatia, Slovenia, etc. But point being is, not only would they have to deal with the Russian problem on the east, but also these other ethnic minorities in the west, particularly Hungarians, the Gypsy population, um, Ruthenians, depending on how they lean. Some of them are much more pro-Ukraine than not. Other ones are much more pro-independence and or autonomy, I should say. But point being is, like, Ukraine may seem very homogenous between a Russian and Ukrainian population, like pretty split down the middle, east-west. But there's still like all these other little factors where federalization would be a quite a hassle for them.
hmm hmm so so the Minsk agreement, of course, is something that Russia is not like. The Minsk agreement is not between Russia and Ukraine. Western media will not tell you that it's not. They will intentionally lie, or they will obfuscate this fact, right? France, Germany, and Russia are signatories on the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement itself is between the eastern part of Ukraine and the rest of Ukraine, and how to resolve this issue. But it's not Russia. So that's another important step. And America, frankly, isn't part of the agreement. It's not written into it. So it's not like the JPCOA, for instance. Um, Now, the fear of the Ukrainians, of course, is, let's say we return to our first scenario where Ukraine decides, we're going to give you Crimea and Donbass, right? And it's interesting that you pointed out the Hungarian diaspora. There are other diasporas, but it's important that you bring up that one. And that is what Ukraine is afraid of, that if it does that, it will set a precedent and other regions will want the same thing. And then maybe within 10 years, it's a much smaller country. So they're not interested in seeing a balkanization begin inside Ukraine, because Ukraine itself, as a territory, is several, jigsaw puzzle pieces that have been put together.
I mean, it's as much as a post-colonial state as some of these Middle Eastern and African countries. If you look at the demographics and the way the borders are divided.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Ukraine is also making it impossible for anyone else, because they've made the Ukrainian language absolutely essential and mandatory. There's certain professions you cannot speak anything but Ukrainian. That wasn't the case, and it's important to remember that this push has been going on since the fall of the Soviet Union, with funding from typical sources like Soros and other NGOs, in order to wipe any memory of uh, Russians who consider themselves Ukrainians living in Ukraine. Uh, Not to mention just the historical ties and the familial ties. So Ukraine is also afraid of seceding this territory, because it would it might give other groups in Ukraine the idea to also separate. Um, Obviously, I think Russia either called Biden's bluff, or maybe was partly serious. They did amass a lot of troops, and basically they got the message clear that we will strike you. It will mean the end of Nord Stream 2, and it will probably also accelerate maybe your efforts, or the efforts of the US, to include Ukraine into NATO. But we will make sure there's almost nothing left of Ukraine before that happens. And I think that's why their minister a few days ago even said that the diplomacy, I'm not talking about Zelensky, I'm talking about somebody in his cabinet, came out and said that only through diplomacy will we achieve anything, and so on and so on. So I wanted to point out how this thing is manifesting, and why it is going the way it is. And like basically Russia is playing a waiting game, right? They're looking for an administration that understands Russia's position, that as a great power they cannot tolerate any more missiles, that are less than 350 kilometers from Moscow. That Poland itself, which is about 500 some odd, is already too close, and that they simply won't tolerate anymore.
And
So
now you see Biden coming out wanting to have a summit just weeks after he called Putin a thug and a killer and
yeah,
refused his offer for a diplomatic meeting, of course over like it was like a Skype or Zoom call. But now he wants to meet up in a neutral third country and do like a Finland summit like Trump did, which is funny in retrospect. Now, of course, I know hypocrisy is a weak argument, but what you can get away with when you're on the quote unquote right team, the fact that if Biden were to have Helsinki 2.0, that would be completely fine. But before I get into some of the details on Biden's proposal, the U.S. administration proposals, I want to point out just in the past 30 years, Ukraine became independent from the Soviet Union in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. In fact, a few months before it was de facto independent. Now, in 1991, 1992, it had a population comparable to some of the power players of Europe, like France and like Germany. And it definitely had the resources and the agriculture to compete. I mean, Ukraine was considered the breadbasket of the Russian Empire for centuries. And you have a lot of coal and iron deposits in the west towards the Carpathian region. Point being is this country post-Soviet independence could have been a powerhouse in Europe on par with a country like France, like Germany. Maybe that's a bit generous of a take, but like maybe like a secondary player in Europe, similar to a country like Italy or even where Poland is today. But point being is, it was so grossly mismanaged and driven to the ground by corruption, by all these different things, that what we have today is a country, and its population has decreased by like 10, 15 million since the fall of the Soviet Union, just because of emigration, deaths of despair, people, below birth rate, below replacement birth rate, etc. But emigration's a really big one out of a lot of these former Soviet states, including Russia for that matter. But that, just to put that in perspective, where Ukraine is today versus what they started out with immediately post-independence.
right. And so, yeah, to continue with the scenarios, of course, as we said last year, I mean, essentially, what America had been was hoping for, that by 2021, there would already be an American Sevastopol base. Russia would be completely, utterly cut off from the West, and it would, there would essentially be a blockade for an indefinite period of time, and really, if America had not fomented a coup on a legally elected president, this would never have happened. And I think that irks them. That if they had left the status quo, Crimea would still be in Ukraine's hands. And obviously, 23 years of massaging this area, hoping to have the outcome, that was not moving quickly enough.
And that's
And
another
so,
thing about Ukrainian leadership. Geographically, especially with Crimea, they could have been a second Turkey.
yes, yes, right. And so it was a great miss. It was a brilliant judo move by Russia. Now, I mean, I've heard reports where the Americans say, well, you can have Crimea. Well, I mean, whatever. I mean, did they say that well, you can bomb to Tbilisi if you like?
They
Um,
also told, I know it's nowhere near comparable with the amount of power and the global influence, but they also told Saddam they would turn a blind eye if he invaded Kuwait, and then, of course, the Gulf War ensued. Now, of course, there
yeah.
hasn't been war on Russia because just of the power disparity between Saddam's Iraq and even Russia in 2014, but the point stands that diplomats will give a lot of reassurances behind closed doors and then immediately revoke them when it becomes convenient. And I mean, that's not a new phenomenon. That's not exclusive to the United States. That's the way diplomacy has been conducted ever since states first made contact with each other.
Hmm. Now, it's still possible that we could have like a new level of escalation that we haven't seen since the beginning of 2015. Right now, we're nearing the beginning of a drier climate that will ensue in May and eastern Ukraine. So a lot of the mud that is there at the end of March, all throughout April, uh, which is problematic for tanks and so on, and armored personnel carriers. It could be that they're waiting for that opportunity, and it's also important to note that not long after the defeat of Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh, the Atlantic Council actually had some discussions on Zoom where they discussed like maybe there is a non-diplomatic way to resolve the issue of the Donbass region. Meaning, if the drone strikes that were used between Turkey, Israel, and Azerbaijan against Armenia were successful, couldn't we implement something like that? Right? And then you have Zelensky doing his utmost to maybe play on those ideas. So he talks with Erdogan, but he's talking to Erdogan about like uh, the situation in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, and Erdogan is commiserating and telling him, yeah, those regions are yours, Crimea is yours, but you should be following the Minsk Accord, which is which is ridiculous because why would you say all of that and still tell him he has to follow the Minsk Accord? I mean,
Perhaps
that's a
hoping for some ethnic autonomy of the few remaining Tatars in Ukraine.
well, I mean,
Perhaps,
Turkey has expressed interest. I mean, they think that
yeah,
like
yeah,
maybe Crimea should be theirs.
yeah. I remember that going around. That was like 2014, and not that that subsided or anything, but that was one of the big things. I know I mentioned this on Sunday when we did our last episode that all the human rights organizations, all the watchdogs were concerned Russia's going to abuse the Tatars in Crimea, and then nothing happened. I think Tatars at this point are only like 5% of the Crimean population right now, ever since the ethnic cleansings and the border changes throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Which that's again, just to clarify, I don't think people in our audience need to hear. But if anyone out there is new, not familiar with the show, which we're not, pinning the exclusive blame. I mean, in that case, yeah, obviously the Russians, the Soviets did it, but it's not like that was the only place in the world where something like that was happening over the past 2 centuries. The
Mm-hmm.
not to go on too much of an aside here, but the amount of ethnic cleansings and redrawing of borders and moving of ethnic groups, I would say since the end of the Napoleonic Wars would be a good gauge for this, has been absurd. I mean, the demographics of pretty much everyone in the world have been radically transformed since then. I mean, you brought up the Nagorno Karabakh conflict. I believe Armenians
Yeah.
first started moving into the region in the 1820s. And, that's not even getting to Palestine and Israel, the Middle East, the massive Armenian diaspora, not only in the Middle East, throughout the world, the location of Russian ethnic minorities. Eastern Europe is another big one, especially after the fall of places like Austria and Germany and the Russian Empire and Soviet Union. The amount of border, I mean that was the cause of World War II. The amount of border redrawings with that, with between the disputes between the Poles and the Germans, and I mean, just I think I think people don't have a good enough context on this sort of stuff. Maybe that warrants an episode of its own. All the way these borders have been redrawn across the world. But getting back to that point, like of course there will always be those kind of pushes, and honestly, with as brazen as Erdogan was, I wouldn't be surprised if he was trying to do some bid for to defend the rights of the Turkic people, the Tatars, within within Eastern Europe, within Ukraine.
Right, right. I mean, and it's using American domestic policy to shape uh, geopolitical policies, international policies, right? Because for them, the only people who are really paying it, and it's a game. Like America, when America pretends that everybody in the world is also an American, what they're doing is they're basically testing like are you you know could you be an American citizen? Like, are you spiritually an American citizen? Are you obsessed with race? Are you obsessed with minority rights?
Would you like
Like,
to come and join the global shopping mall? Is pretty much the question.
yeah,
And that's even
so
an
like,
outdated way of phrasing it. That's like 90s, 2000s sort of rhetoric. Yeah, it's escalated
yeah,
into that stuff like, do you care about the poor oppressed people across the world? Will you fight for the liberation of all peoples? Almost getting that sort of like perpetual revolution sort of ideology. Like it's a, I know people talk about a lot how the neoconservatives have the root in Trotsky ideas, but it is this just bastard union of
yeah,
neoliberal ideas with this sort of like early communist, like we're talking 1910, 1920s revolutionary fervor. It's this bastard union between the two, and I would say it's pretty much the result of American foreign policy. That's what it's been since at least the Cold War, and that those ideas, of course, have spread globally with a nonstop assault from that since I would say 1945, if not before that. And to the point where, like, yeah, again, you have people like you have like totalitarian dictators who employ this sort of rhetoric nowadays.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh, yeah, you'll have places that would hardly be someone's first idea of a liberal democracy, wagging their finger at America for the way they've, treated blacks or Native Americans, and so on and so on. In a way, so America, when it does that, is testing to see how much everyone has imbibed, the American theopolitical cult, right? Are you in my framework? Are you like me? Do you just need a little bit of reforming? I mean, the point, of course, is to for them to accept the general framework and then to argue the details. And you can't win in that situation because, of course, they've mainframed you. You've accepted their framing of reality. So um, so that's kind of like what I wanted to say about Russia. I suppose I'll finish by uh, saying that really they've got like till this summer to to do something uh, in order to stop Nord Stream 2. Like I say, Ukraine has so far not committed itself to this gigantic attack. It has not happened. Lavrov has been equally stern. I guess we'll get into the the request by Biden for Putin to join him in a summit, but also this whole ridiculous fallout from Biden's announcement that he's leaving Afghanistan. But so anything can still happen. But I think right now it's not looking likely. Ukraine is not going to take the chance because I think they understand. It's taken a long time, I think, for them to understand that this is a red line. That if Ukraine has to be sacrificed, it will.
Yeah, and again, there's the irony of the cabal that runs Ukraine. That's of course in league with the European Union, with the United States, with NATO, etc. Again, just this cabal of globalists, as we can call them, just for simplicity's sake, sending off these far right nationalists, these people who join groups like the Azov Battalion, the ones who still have the SS parades put on their Stahlhelms and be like, the wrong side won the war, sending them into the meat grinder while they, of course, orchestrate everything you claim to hate. It is, it's one of those cases, and again, it's a win-win for them. They get rid of these people, and they also get to use
Yes.
them to
Yeah.
push back against their enemies. And I suppose that's been the case of pretty much every liberal empire. Look at the sort of people the U.S. military recruits. It's it's these people who are again mainly foundational Americans. You look at the places they come from. They come a lot from the South. I think Texas is probably one of the biggest states for military recruitment. And they take these people who you think would, who claim to hate all these things the government's doing now, whether through ignorance or whatever, don't see what they're doing, and sending them to the meat grinders in places like Afghanistan, Iraq. I mean, it's frankly one of the most ingenious tactics liberals have developed, sending these people who, like, again, would normally be the biggest threat to the system, psyoping them to thinking they're doing some holy duty, and then conveniently eliminating the problem while again sending your enemies to fight your battles for you. It is evil. It is depraved in many ways, especially with the kind of wars they're sending them into, and like what we're doing in places like Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan. Which again, we'll get into some of the Afghanistan news in a minute. But you also have to admire the brilliance of this sort of strategy that they've employed. I would say, since uh, World War II, I'd say the earliest. Vietnam, especially. Look at the sort of people who were fighting and dying in Vietnam during the civil rights movement in America. You think a lot of those people, especially the ones who volunteered and weren't drafted, had their sympathies with the uh, you know racial tensions within the United States at the time. And again, this has been time and time again since I would say, yeah, World War II, arguably even World War One. But I digress on that point in particular. But getting into the Biden offered to Putin. So, of course, what was it? About 6 weeks ago when he calls Putin the thug and the killer who we
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
no business speaking to you. Yeah, it was a month ago, 6 weeks ago, somewhere in that time frame.
Yeah. I
And
think about a
now,
month.
after this Ukraine blunder failed to uh, give the desired result, all of a sudden Biden wants to play nice. He wants to talk. He wants to do a sort of Nixon to China moment where he goes and reconciles the big bad enemy who he has been saber rattling against since 2019, since the beginning of the campaign. Of course, before that, but especially since the beginning of the campaign, he was saying stuff during the Democratic debates about how we must hold Russia to account for their interference in the 2016 election. Blah 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 blah. And of course, all the rhetoric they've employed since. But now, all of a sudden, he's looking for a neutral third country to host this summit. I don't believe there's been any word from Russia diplomatically on whether they'd accept. I
No.
wouldn't be surprised if the Russians accepted. I know Putin, again, surprisingly enough, even at this point, is still pretty conciliatory when it comes to diplomatic relations. Granted, I mean, he's good at official state meetings. It's really, I would say, one of the best things he excels at in terms of just an entire time in office. He's good at sitting down with leaders, whether from everyone from Xi Jinping to Obama to Trump to Erdogan to Rouhani, even Kim Jong Un recently. He's pretty versatile at this, so I wouldn't be surprised if he takes Biden up on this offer, considering the fact he initially offered to do it again just virtually. But point being is, I could see a situation where Putin accepts and he's like, yeah, let's let's talk about this, let's be civil about this, and Biden has a bad day or whatever, and all of a sudden they say, pull out, sorry, we're busy. Domestic crisis, since, again, with some of the trial stuff and some of the racial tensions at home, I can imagine there's probably going to be some street violence pretty soon. Oh, well, the president has to attend to domestic matters. I'm sorry, Mr. Putin, he can't meet with you. Some canned excuse like that. But that's what I foresee for any potential Biden Putin summit. Or if there actually is, I imagine it's going to be a very swift meeting. It's going to be very short, very formal, because, again, we all know Biden isn't the best orator, even under the best of circumstances, but especially as his mental capacity seems to be slipping. Now, of course, I'm no doctor, so I'll not say for certain, but especially as his mental capacity seems to be slipping. Has he had any major diplomatic visits yet? I think that's mostly been in the hands of Blinken and Kamala, hasn't it? And
Yeah.
I know, again, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was just in Israel, as we covered last episode. But it's been, I think Kamala was in, what was it, Costa Rica, or somewhere in Central America recently. Blinken, of course, has been all over the place since. But I don't think Biden has actually sat down with another head of state or head of government since he's taken office. So that would be his first diplomatic visit, if I am not mistaken, which would be rather telling considering the fact, again, the big Cold War, we have to confront Russia guy sitting down with Putin. But again, I don't see a way the Biden team allows this to happen because of again, like I said, his seemingly declining mental state. And I'll be surprised if it actually comes to fruition. I could see, again, the Russians accepting the offer, but the Americans pulling out at last minute because of the reasons I just laid out.
My, my, I'll answer. I'll give you my take based on the second thing I want to say. I'll say it first, because you brought up that Putin might be conciliatory. My own belief is that he won't, but let's say that he is. He would have an opportunity to basically, under controlled circumstances, he would have an opportunity to show up Biden, uh, because, and I say this because in Russian media, for instance, the transcripts were revealed, and they're very different than the transcripts that were revealed in the U.S. So let's begin with what was acknowledged. Well, I mean, the transcripts simply state, um, yes, we know Biden has invited us, and he had already invited us for some climate change thing prior. We are aware. There's simply no answer to it. Number two, they reveal some of the key points for this possible third country summit. Um, One is, again, climate change. Two is Afghanistan. Three, of course, is Ukraine. And a new missile treaty. Notice how that was omitted from Western sources, right? But the Russians are glad to tell you what it was that Biden phoned Putin and asked to talk to him about, right? Now, it is in Putin's, the ball is in Putin's court. He can do whatever he wants. He's basically called Biden's bluff. Um, you know, calling him a thug because the Navalny thing didn't turn out the way he wanted it to. You know, I mean, I don't think Putin particularly cares, and obviously the rise in casualties in eastern Ukraine, the new shelling on civilians by Ukraine has not in any way fomented the kind of big battle that we were all thinking we would see, of the sorts that we saw in 2014, and particularly at the beginning of 2015. That hasn't happened. Yes, you are still getting like 2, 3 fatalities a week, but it is not the kind of carnage that we saw those years ago, where several hundred would be killed in a day. Um, so that said, I would say that under controlled circumstances, Putin could have an optic victory over Biden. But my guess is that Russia is fed up. Um, and again, I stress the reason I think it's fed up is it didn't give any reply. It simply said, we got the letter, thanks. Like that's not a reply. Uh, if you judge by basically the way Lavrov has been, Lavrov is usually very subtle. He's a pretty suave guy, and he's a very good diplomat. But after Borrell and his criticism of Borrell, specifically telling Borrell, if you come to Russia and you start whining about Navalny or show up at the protests or in the court, it's off. We're not going to have a discussion. Well, you know, in many ways, Lavrov is a changed man since then when he's dealing with the West, and particularly when he's dealing with the US. So the kid gloves are off. I think Russia is sending the message, when you're ready to really talk, we'll talk. But it's not, it's the world isn't sometime between 1991 and 2007. That period is over. Like, we're you can't call the president of this country a killer and soulless and then snap your fingers and say, well, we're going to need you. I mean, that's done. So I personally think Russia is not going to do it, or Russia is going to heighten the stakes. After all, it's Biden who has lost face in Ukraine. It's the West who is panicking. Um, Not that the panic is necessarily real. I don't think they think that Russia is going to invade and take over. What they're upset about is that Russia is literally monitoring the situation and is having a very negative effect on Ukrainian forces to effectively fight against the rebels. That's it. That that hasn't happened. Ukraine knows the only resolution to this crisis is to maintain, the strong centralized nationalistic approach, um, where other Ukrainian minorities understand that it's the Ukrainian majority that's in charge, and that there's not going to be any room for any kind of federalization. Uh, so they know that the only way to resolve this is literally to go to war. You have to go to war, or you have to wait until there's a Russian leader that will just, for no reason at all, um, allow you to, I don't know, uh, ethnically cleanse everyone in Crimea and Donbass that you don't like, and then join NATO afterwards. That's not, I mean, that's not a Putin stance. That's a Russia stance. Russia is not going to be in favor of that.
Yeah, I remember some of the
Russia,
hit pieces coming out about Navalny from even the people who were more pro-Ukraine. It's like, oh, he claims to be this moderate, he claims to be this reformer, but you look at his foreign policy on Ukraine, it's exactly the same as Putin. He said he wouldn't give up Crimea and blah, 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 blah. I don't think there's any political movement in Russia, even, I think you'd have to be like the, like, furthest liberal of liberal to think that Russia should withdraw from Crimea. That I'm talking internally in Russia, and these are probably the same people who think that Chechnya should be given independence again. Like this very radical fringe within Russia, because I mean the top three parties, and that's the United Russia, which is Putin's sort of big tent party, even though he's technically not part of it. The Communist Party, the Liberal Democratic Party under Zhirinovsky, that makes up the majority of the Russian electorate. Now, how much you believe of like the official election results, you have to admit that those three factions are the ones who dominate Russian politics and dominate pretty much Russian thought. None of them,
right.
all of them supported the annexation of Crimea. All of them support more or less Russia's foreign policy. There's a pretty big consensus on it among the parties that actually have any sway within Russian politics and society. So the idea that it's going to be that, I mean, I maybe I'm giving Boris Yeltsin too much credit here, but I struggle to think even if he was in office or somebody like him was in office and put in the Crimea situation, I don't even see somebody like that withdrawing from Crimea, at least under. I mean, they may cave to pressure more easily, but again, I really don't see any possibility that Russia withdraws from Crimea voluntarily.
It's sovereignty suicide. Why would you like? Why would you do such a thing, right? I mean, it's not like, even if that was Russia's only weak flank, and of course it's not. Even if it was, it would be an incredible loss. But it's not Russia's only weak flank. You know,
Yeah, not only
it has to
strategically
deal.
but symbolically, like what it means to Russia. Like it's
Yeah,
it'd be like Serbia as it has losing Kosovo. It's losing that key part of the heartland of your nation. Now I know Russia, again controlled, wavered back and forth, and most recently they've controlled it pretty much from the 1780s through the fall of the Soviet Union. But it's like giving that up is just unconscionable in terms of what it means to
yeah,
Russia symbolically, what it means strategically, what it means economically. It's just a there is nothing short of an all-out war where you actually push them back and push them back, probably to the last man when it comes to that case, out of that peninsula because it's just so vital. And like you said, that's clearly not the only area, but it's one of the few non-negotiables. And the idea that we can just do all this, we can make all these assurances to Ukraine, or the delusion of Ukraine that they can get it back, which is why I suspect, probably not at the United States, but there's going to come some point down the road, maybe in the 2030s, whenever, where, I mean, most countries have officially recognized anyway, and the ones that do have sanctions, some of them specifically have sanctions on Crimea and not Russia as a whole, which, again, that gets into, the particulars of it, whatever. But especially countries that are increasing ties with Russia, like Germany, I could see it. Maybe they won't officially recognize it for quite some time, but pretty much saying, there's nothing we can do about the situation. That was pretty much Trump's stance. Now, Trump, he flip flopped a lot, of course, that is Donald Trump talking, but towards the end there and towards the beginning, funny enough, it was actually those just a couple years in the middle when he said, it's Russian. There's not really anything we can do about it. Yeah, sure, it should be Ukrainian, whatever, but at the end of the day, looking at it realistically, it's Russia's, and again, that goes into a lot of territorial disputes, whether that be Cyprus, whatever. But point being is, just to repeat myself yet again, they're not giving it up voluntarily, and nobody is going to commit that level of manpower for such a task that Russia would view as an attack on its very existence. Because, again, Russia, as in its modern form, is impossible without at least access to Crimean ports, if not outright control of them.
Yeah. Yeah. So to return to a possible summit, I wouldn't say there's no chance at all. I would just say that it's not in Russia's interest to have one, because it would be a media circus, just like the last one. Uh, Biden would have an opportunity to look like a statesman. The circus would jump on Putin. Uh, when are you going to execute Navalny? Why did you poison the Skripals, or however you pronounce their names? It will be one after another. Do you still deny that interfered in our elections in 2016 and apparently even in 2020? That's what it will be like. It will be a circus. The whole point will be to have a televised event that will strictly be about an American audience. Biden needs to look like a winner, and uh, only a summit would be the vehicle by which he could achieve that. If Putin denies him a summit, that's it. I mean, Biden doesn't have a war in eastern Ukraine. He looks like an idiot. He called Putin I mean, besides a thug, he's called him a soulless killer. Well, I mean, yeah. So what are you going to do about it? And you can even see, like in interviews with Jeff Todd, but Mr. President, what are you going to do about Russia? What are you going to do? And they're driving this. And I
Well,
didn't
just to
see it
interrupt you here
until
for a second, I
just
saw some
later.
I saw some news from about an hour ago. The U.S. has canceled its warship deployment to the Black Sea.
Yes, yes, that's true. It's good you pointed that out. I forgot about that. But I just saw a clip from CNN, where a Pentagon or former Pentagon member is giving reasons why pulling out of Afghanistan would be terrible, right? Um, the Americans have painted themselves into this corner. It was fine when Biden wanted to get reelected, but you can see that things are kind of, he doesn't, his administration doesn't have a grasp on them. We've got protests happening again in Minnesota, uh, just outside of Minneapolis. It's not really like, I mean, I don't know if they're going to be as big as they were last year. Certainly, I cannot imagine Apple, Target, any of the other big corporations that funded the bailouts for these people. They haven't jumped on board. So, but it still is bad press. Biden is not in a good spot right now. He may have high approval, but it's not really based on anything. He's not achieving anything. And the longer his term progresses, the more it'll be apparent that he hasn't achieved anything.
Yeah, and that's depending on how much. I mean, again, he's been famously an absent president compared to the last two we had under Trump and Obama. And especially, again, if he falls into ailing health, which a man of his age, I mean, again, his mental health, and I'll say, for the sake of us being on YouTube, seemingly is not the best. Who knows what will happen to his physical health over these next few years? Something, I mean, again, he had the incident where he tripped climbing up the stairs. And again, like, he's a 78, 70-year-old, 79-year-old man. Those sort of things can happen very rapidly at that age. But moving on from
Right.
that, Afghanistan. So,
Afghanistan. Yep.
of course, there was the diplomatic machinations last year, Trump's negotiations with the Taliban. You even had Pompeo going to Qatar to meet with Taliban representatives last February. And they came to a tentative agreement, one that we saw on the show probably wouldn't come to fruition, but apparently it looks like that is going to be. Now, in that agreement, it said U.S. forces would be out by May 1st. And of course, I think especially in early 2020, Trump was anticipating a second term to be able to at least carry out some version of this plan, but lo and behold, we have a new administration. Now, they've pushed that deadline back from May 1st to September 11th, 2021, of all days. Now, I think, honestly, they're trying to go for the symbolism. Like, 9/11 was 20 years ago, and now we're finally out of America's longest war, and this is a real credit to the Biden administration. I think they deliberately picked that date for the symbology to bring it to a clean close, and that, again, sort of like bring it full circle so they can pat themselves in the back for it. Now, of course, this will not be a full withdrawal, so to speak. Now, we'll get a lot of troops out of there, but of course, there'll still be like the diplomatic postings and all the other various operations we have there, particularly with the CIA intelligence. I think even the DEA and, yeah, the Drug Enforcement Agency, all that sort of stuff. All that will be there, but in terms of like the official like troop deployments we have that we've had since 2001, if this pans out, that will be coming to a close. Now, the British have announced their intentions to also withdraw by the September 11th deadline, pretty much all of their troops. And you've seen ripple effects that the British are the only ones who have announced so far, but I imagine other countries with residual deployments in Afghanistan will probably go the same way. Now, I'm going to say what I said back in September when there looked to be a withdrawal that was nearing by the end of the year under Trump. Now, while I completely support getting out of Afghanistan, I think we're wasting our time, our money, and lives there, and pretty much nobody has benefited from all besides opium smugglers and those who have an intention to keep this decrepit empire on its feet. But I will also say I fear the implications of this move, what it really means, by removing troops from a theater we have invested so much time and effort and blood into. Now, a lot of people will speculate gearing up to move them to Eastern Europe, gearing up to move them into East Asia. Now, it's not like even today, I think our current deployments are around 7,000. It's not like 7,000 personnel, especially considering the fact not all of them are combat, is that much in the grand scheme of things, especially when facing down other major powers like Russia and China. But point being, the fact that they're willing to pull that much attention away from Afghanistan really makes you think A, something bad is on the horizon domestically. The fact that we're not going to be able to maintain all these fringe imperial outposts with what's coming domestically. Now, I wouldn't attribute the impending racial tensions based on this trial going on to that, but I will say that's a function of that. Maybe it's economic, maybe it's whatever, or maybe it's a foreign theory, like I said, like somewhere in Europe, somewhere in East Asia, somewhere else in the Middle East, that is, or Central Asia, whatever. But point being is, while I think this is good on the surface, and again, this isn't a partisan thing. This isn't just because I don't like Biden. I said this under Trump too. You can go back to it's sometime in September, October when we talked about this. I think any withdrawal from Afghanistan is a foreboding sign. As we said, it's not a full withdrawal. I can only imagine what unofficial numbers will have their post withdrawal, but the fact that we're willing to, at least on the public stage, in face value, step away from this, something we have, again, poured so much into, has been a top priority of every administration. Every president from Bush onward has put hyper focused on Afghanistan, and not necessarily for bad reason with how involved we've been there. I can only think this is opening a new chapter that may be equally as bad, if not worse.
Yes. I mean, it's a really big deal that they're pulling out of Afghanistan. My guess is that they won't. I'll believe it when I see it. I mean, it's a essentially what they're doing is they have cynically kicked the can down the road. They could not let it appear like this that they're going to fulfill Trump's plan. All right. So May 1st was the tentative due date, and um, cynically, they decided not only to push it further so that Trump doesn't get any acknowledgement for it, although I believe it was the New York Times had an article, and it was not until the end that you read, oh yeah, well, this plan was actually signed last year, and May 1st was the due date. But I think the whole point of using September 11th, this is a bit of speculation from my part, is to remind everybody that they're leaving on September 11th and how horrible September 11th was. And maybe if plans change, maybe we should stay there. Because, never forget. Now, I don't know if they're that cynical, but uh, I'm assuming they're going to leave like at least 500 troops there, maybe more. Like I say, we've already witnessed like literally less than a day after the announcement, there's already, Pentagon experts who are already stating why leaving Afghanistan would be terrible. Um, Now, I haven't had the chance today to watch any of those clips after coming home from work, but my guess is we're going to see a lot more of these guys.
Now,
Biden
with
has not. When Biden and Blinken have had to deal with Todd, the anchor, in both cases, they don't really have like really good answers. Like, are you willing to go to war over Taiwan? Can America handle both Russia and China? Uh, what are you going to do about Ukraine? There isn't really a satisfying answer. They just tell you that they have a lot of tools in their toolkit, and when the time is right, they'll use them. Like
ironically
it's
enough,
always been
almost like Trump, but without the bluster and charm.
right. They have a secret weapon, but they can't tell you about it. And when they use it, everything will change. It's kind of like the way they probably view this summit, right? Like once the summit is over, we'll both get what we want and prove, Russia and Putin are evil. It'll just happen. Summits are like our specialty. I think personally it's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. Uh, Neither the summit nor them pulling out of Afghanistan. There'll just be so much pressure, the kind that was exerted on Trump, that Biden's team will eventually buckle.
I will say I slightly deviate from you, and with the fact that Pentagon officials are criticizing this, I think we may be in a, for lack of a better term, genuine imperial crisis where the White House, the administration says we can no longer possibly tolerate Afghanistan, our most valued foreign policy topic since post 9/11, and there's just no way we can continue this, and we have to cut our losses. Whereas the Hawks and the Pentagon, not that the White House is lacking in Hawks, are saying no, we must stay committed to this. This is our mission, and we must see it through to the end, whatever that so-called end is. Now, if you ask Max Booth, that could be another 300 years before we finally bring peace to Afghanistan, like the British colonized India or whatever. But point being is, I think the fact that Biden and the Pentagon are going to head to head, because Trump and the Pentagon are going head to head, that was just a average day in the press. But Biden and the Pentagon going head to head has a very foreboding feeling to me. And maybe it's just
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I read too much into these things. Maybe it's just because I'm too pessimistic. But like I said, the fact that the establishment incarnate with, again, Vice President Kamala Harris, somebody like Blinken as Secretary of State, someone like Austin as Secretary of Defense, the fact that that team is butting heads with the top brass, I can only think this isn't theater, this isn't performance. This is probably a genuine crisis, and it's not just like Trump's bluster or Trump deviating, but the fact that, again, that comes from the people who are on the quote unquote right side. It shows, yeah, there's probably something worse happening that they're not going to tell us about.
Hmm. I'm with you. Like, if this really goes through, I almost expect like something domestically awful is going to happen because I mean, it's a retraction. There's no other way to put it.
Yeah, and
And
I know you can't make exact parallels, but I did see something interesting on Twitter
yeah,
the other day. It compared graphs of America in the late 2010s to the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, and that was like life expectancy, like all that sort of stuff, and like the similar downward trends that they're taking. And you know, again, and not to draw too many parallels, but just 2 years after the Soviet Union called it quits in Afghanistan, they were no longer a country. And, you know, as soon as they called it quit in Afghanistan, their global power had pretty much diminished to just the region. I mean, at that point, yeah, now, of course, I know they didn't apply force. I know Gorbachev sort of cut them loose. Eastern Europe was in revolt against them. Their satellites were in revolt against them. But I will say, not to draw too many comparisons, but with those two sets of data, I can only imagine that something domestically is on the horizon, whether that be massive social unrest, massive economic problems, which, you know, again, these people have economic projections in the future, not always right, that, of course, they don't tell us about. You know, there's a lot of classified information, even on something as mundane as what's the market going to look like tomorrow, or what's the market going to look like in 3 months, or whatever. But point being is, I think much more likely there's something foreboding domestically in the next few months to a year. Possibly foreign theater, maybe again Russia or China, whatever, when it comes to Ukraine, Taiwan, Eastern Europe, East Asia, etc. But I would put my money on the fact that they're butting heads over this and that they want to cut back on some of these imperial commitments. That they're letting, now, of course, they've tried to fight back in Storm Stream 2, but they're letting that slide. They're not really addressing the China situation, not really addressing the Korea situation, because they know America's ability to exert its influence abroad is quickly diminishing and it may be taking a massive hit in the near future. Now, of course, they would never tell us about that. We wouldn't know until it actually happened. But point being is, from their perspective, from the information they had, that may be the conclusions that they're drawing right now and are trying to prepare accordingly for this.
yeah, it's I mean, I think we all know Afghanistan's importance in terms of mineral richness and how important this would be, let's say, for China, and to maybe a lesser extent, maybe Russia can't project its power there as well. I don't know. It certainly would have a difficult time, I think, inserting itself there after the Afghan war. But I mean,
Yeah, I think
anybody
even like,
will
you
have a
know, 30,
difficult
40
time.
years on where the wounds are still too fresh to the Russian population to get too involved in Afghanistan, that is.
Yes, yes. And so, there was a tentative agreement with with China and with uh, Afghanistan for excavating minerals. That has been put on hold. Um, you can see why America would want to hold on to it. I mean, they'll tell you it's about getting young girls into college, but what they're really concerned about is an adversary, a competitor, getting access to those minerals. Because though China is depleted in many minerals and certainly depleted and certainly doesn't have the energy self-reliance that many other great powers do, it does have minerals, and it would it would almost seal the deal completely for minerals, particularly those for mobile devices, computers, but there's a whole range of other things. And they're all necessary. They need them in tiny amounts for each product, but they're needed because they're sold in the hundreds of millions. So I can see why China would want this area very badly. This, but it's a dangerous area. It's so tantalizing, and yet it's sequestered in this most difficult terrain, and a people that are so resilient and so capable of spoiling all of these efforts to, you know, I don't mean this in a colonial way, but to bring Afghanistan into the modern era in terms of infrastructure and technology and all those sorts of things.
Well, I think one last angle we need to discuss, and we got into this a little bit in our pre-show chat, is Pakistan and the ramifications that could have there.
Mhm.
And that could be one of the other reasons. A lot of people speculate, especially with how intertwined Pakistan is with Afghanistan, Pakistan's recent moves towards China. This could be a deliberate move to destabilize the system there. Now, Pakistan hasn't been too politically unstable over the past years, but it's been more unstable than I think most people would feel comfortable as a nuclear power being. And who knows, this could be the impetus of instability that, of course, pours across the border because American troops, at least their presence there, or whatever, do maintain some degree of order. Now, of course, the Taliban has been allowed to control so much of the country, but I would say that was allowed. They were willing to make those negotiations with the Taliban, and it didn't get to that point. Now, I'm not saying that we could have single-handedly subjugated Afghanistan because if we could have, we would have already, and clearly we haven't. You were just talking about how they were people who are pretty resistant to change, pretty resistant to outside influence, but you realize once chaos breaks out there, and I think you were pointing this out to me, it's almost inevitably going to break out in Pakistan. Now, will Pakistan descend into a civil war? Who knows? But point being is, any major change in Afghanistan will deeply impact Pakistan, and I would say even the other way around, any deep change in Pakistan will even deeper impact Afghanistan. So the two are pretty inseparable, especially with, I think it's the Pashtun tribes on the border that I mean, there might as well not even be a border there because they're the same people that are living in the same tribal lands they have for millennia. And just because some post-colonial borders drew it, that's not going to stop them from really. And I don't think the authorities, well, the authorities on the Afghan side, they have no power. I don't think the authorities on the Pakistan side particularly care. But if violence starts breaking out, if people get more militant, they might care. And I could see this. I'm not making any definitive prediction on how it would happen or if it would happen, but I could see this escalating to a great degree even on the other side of the border.
Yes, and you can see why maybe America removing itself from that area could be worse off for China than remaining there.
Yeah, and of course,
It's
once if Pakistan were to fall into instability, that would be fantastic for India, who, despite everything, seem to be on a bit of an up and up. It seems like the Hindu nationalists have really locked that down, and they're really able. Now, of course, India is very hostile to China, but they've managed to balance both good terms with the U.S. and Russia. So that could be their opportunity to be a real power player and express, maybe propel them into great power status by managing this conflict and really being the power broker in places like, I don't imagine Pakistan. I imagine the relationship's much tense there, but places like Afghanistan. So it could be India's time to shine, so to speak, and that could be another angle we could look at this from.
Yeah, it's tantalizing to think because Pakistan itself has some minorities, and I remember even years ago people already speculating on a civil war within Pakistan because there's these, there's some ports in Pakistan that China is interested in, and people have talked about. Now, I'm so sorry, I didn't know that we would. I mean, I knew we would be touching on Pakistan, but I myself wasn't prepared to go into depth. So I don't recall the name of the minority there that some people are speculating uh, might. might make things difficult
Are those
for
the
for
Baluchis? They're also in like
yeah.
Iran or something, like Balokis. I don't know how it's pronounced. But it's
Sounds
again one
like
of those
that.
tribal groups, and that straddles the border between Iran and Pakistan.
Right. And so um that's a possibility. I don't really see the evidence for it just yet, but it's interesting to consider. And we spoke about it on the last show about Pakistan's growing ties with China. You can see how that's creating a headache for India. So yeah, I mean Afghanistan could be. Who knows? We don't know if it's going to go into another round of fighting, but at the moment, uh, the Taliban is actually calling the shots. They have like more or less successfully won this. Now, will this was all this a prelude to the country becoming westernized? I'll give Vietnam as an example. So that was for the longest time America's longest war. And the curious thing that happened was, of course, after America left, and there was a war between Vietnam and China. It was sometime in the 80s and a little bit but basically by the 90s where Vietnam was westernizing itself. So it dropped the Chinese script. Probably it had a lot to do with the war that it had with China. Uh, but it began to accept the sort of theopolitical idea of reality that projects primarily out of America, but it's there in the rest of the West. And the West, too, has fine tuned itself to accept the American interpretation of the world and of reality. So, you could argue, did America win or lose that? You know, certainly the fall of the Soviet Union had a major impact, but we don't know. We don't know. America leaving Afghanistan, does it mean in 10 years, or is this a very different time? Because it is actually a very different time. There isn't like Afghanistan doesn't belong to an access of a certain ideology. Um, it's basically fighting anyone who goes there. It probably tolerates the Pakistanis the most, but it itself is also a pretty diverse country with its own minorities and factions. So it's hard to tell. My guess is it there's a possibility that it could develop, but it won't be the West that will help it develop.
Yeah, I think that's
Only because we're not living 50, 60 years ago. It's not that time.
yeah, I think that's a fair assessment of the situation. Or conversely, could become the uh, proxy battleground between I don't know, say China and India, which I'm not saying that's too likely, but look at all the possibilities here, and I don't see Afghanistan developing too much. I could see if the Chinese get the upper hand, at least protecting the areas that are strategically important to them, the areas they can mine minerals, etc. But other than that, really, I don't see Afghanistan really moving into the 21st century or even 20th century, whatever, technologically or anything like that. So definitely a lot of things brewing on the surface. Hopefully, we'll be able to do a show Saturday because I know you guys seem to really like those Saturday time slots just based on the viewer counts. And hopefully, as things are coming together, that will be the case. But other than that, I don't have anything else. Do you have anything else?
No, I just thought it would be nice if we spent a little more time uh, talking about the situation in Ukraine, and then we've had this other news that has come along that is well, I mean, it's really developed the content for the show, so kind of happy about that.
Well, excellent. Now, thank you everyone for tuning into this week's episode of the War Report. We will see you guys probably on Saturday. Don't hold us to the word. Maybe next Monday, whatever. But whenever we see you next, we look forward to it. And until then, goodbye.
Take care.